All right, so we're going to wrap up the perception and action and the affordance-based control notes here with just a few slides. Now, there might be something that I was getting at in the previous video that might not have been completely clear and obvious. So I'm going to try to address that. Now, the part I'm talking about is that when I'm talking about the perception action cycle, I said that it was different from standard control theory approaches to the control of movement. And you might think, well, it certainly sounds a lot like the feedback loop business, right? And so what is the difference between the perception action cycle and a feedback loop? That's something I think we need to unpack a little bit. So I want to start by doing that here. On the left, I have a reminder of control theory. And one thing to say about the feedback loop is that while there is perception, right, because that's the input, if you recall, in the diagram, the flow chart for that, and then there's action, which is the output. There were some things in between, right? The controller and the control signal, and the process. And so one of the things that we're trying to make an argument for here with affordance-based control and the perception action cycle is, again, we're not inserting a controller or stages of computation between perception and action, right? And one example of that I had kind of mentioned in the previous video is the possibility when it comes to thinking about the graspability of an object, that I can somehow perceive an object in terms of its exact metric size, and then engage in some kind of implicit mental computations to compare the metric size of an object to the size of my hand and use that to determine whether an object is graspable. And that would certainly be some kind of a computational cognitive stage that would have to be inserted between perception and action, right? I would have to perceive the object, perceive my hand size, and then engage in some stages of computation, and then use the output of that computation to determine whether I can grasp the object with one hand versus two hands, and engage in some sort of action selection decision making or something along those lines. And that's not what the perception action cycle is saying, right? The perception action cycle is saying that the affordance is perceived directly, and that the spatiotemporal information that we obtain through perception, through the optic flow, is then used directly in the control of action, which generates new spatiotemporal information. Of course, it's that spatiotemporal side of things that I had emphasized in the previous optic flow stuff lecture, is very important here, because perception, well, I should say action is inherently spatiotemporal. And so the point is that we need to make sure that when we talk about perception, we also do so in spatiotemporal terms, which is how we can make the study of perception compatible with the study of action. When we think of it from a control theory perspective, that's not necessarily true, that it makes perception and action inherently compatible. Usually the idea is that perceptual information, it takes a certain form, which then has to be operated on by the controller and transformed into an appropriate motor command that is then sent to the muscles, right? So that part of control theory is very distinct from the perception action cycle. But there's something else, and that's what I have here on this slide, which is what we might call the discretization, if that's a word, of movement control. So the idea is that according to control theory, movements are performed in discrete packages, if you will, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, with feed-forward control, it might be very obvious, because the idea is that you have that input, you have the motor command, and then you have the output, and that's it. That's a single movement with a beginning, middle, and end. And so because it has a beginning, middle, and end, it's over, right? And that makes it discrete. It's done, right? And then anything I do after that is a brand new movement that has its own beginning, middle, and end. And in doing things this way, what we would say is that every action that we perform is just one single discrete action followed by another single discrete action, and that all of our complex movements that we perform are essentially a long concatenated series of discrete movements, right? So I reach and I pick up one object, and then that's it, that's done. And then I might engage in another action after that, and then another which maybe I grab the object and bring it because maybe it's a cup of water. So I bring it to my mouth and sip from it. And that's another action. And then another action would be to put the cup back on the table. And then another action would be to go do something else with my hands, right? And so all behavior is really just a series of individual discrete movements that are concatenated together. And that's life, is a series of concatenated movements from our entire lifespan. So that's a feed forward theory, right? Now, feedback says that we don't just have the perception or the input and then a command and then an output, but rather as the output is happening, I'm continuously feeding information back to the controller. And what that essentially does is it actually subdivides these discrete movements into smaller pieces, right? So the idea is that I perform an action, and as that action is happening, I wait for feedback, and then I receive that feedback, and then I'm able to compute to do a little bit more of the action, and then I have to wait for feedback, and then I have to do a little bit more of the action. And so I can even take a reaching movement and start subdividing it into what we call sub-movements. And again, the entire reach is now just a concatenation of a series of sub-movements. And again, it really is a discretization of the action itself. And that's how we're going to try to contrast affordance-based control with control theory, is to argue that affordance-based control, and importantly, this corollary idea, dynamical systems theory, does not discretize movements, but rather it treats movements as being as continuous and ongoing. And that's how I had described the perception action cycle, right? Is that perception generates action information, which continuously generates new perceptual information. And of course, that new perceptual information is continuously used in the control of action, and on it goes, right? And so we end up with continuity of action and perception, as well as, and this idea of things being cyclical in a way. Now, cyclical implies repetitive, and some actions are somewhat repetitive. And I'll explain that in a second. Some are not necessarily super repetitive, but there may still be some continuity entailed here. So that means we don't have to talk about there ever being a beginning or an end when it comes to talking about action. And in fact, traditional psychology concepts like the stimulus and the response would also be a little bit obsolete at this point, right? Maybe that's not obvious, but when you think about a stimulus and a response, the stimulus is the input and the response is the output per control theory. And so the stimulus response approach to behavior is also an approach that is one that discretizes behavior into these little chunks, SR, 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 right? And so the dynamical systems approach is, because it's rejecting the discretization of movement, it's also then rejecting the idea that we can somehow subdivide and explain human action as a series of stimulus response type behaviors. A couple of important key terms from dynamical systems would be things like autonomy, and that makes it distinct from control theory, because control theory is an example of what's called allonomy. So what do I mean by that? Well, an autonomous system is a system that is self-governed. That's what the term means, right? And versus an autonomous system is a system that's governed by something that's outside of or external to it. So if we think of the body, right, and the musculature of the body, if we describe it in terms of control theory, we're describing it from the perspective of being controlled by something else. So the muscles are controlled by the brain and some sort of controller in the brain, represented by the controller box in our control theory flowchart. That's an autonomous system because there's the controller and the controlled are separated from each other, right? An autonomous system is one that self-controls itself and is therefore self-organized. And self-organization is an important part of this theory here. What in the world does that mean, though? What is self-organization and self-control or an autonomous system? And then also, what is emergence? Well, I'm going to remind myself real quick what's on the next slide. I don't want to talk about that quite yet. Let me use a metaphor, analogy, maybe, I guess is better. Let's think of a pendulum, right? So if I have a pendulum, a weight on a string hanging from on something, right? And I can pull it back and let it swing. And it's going to swing on its own. I'm not controlling it. Nothing is really controlling it. So we could say that its action at this point, its behavior, if you want to use that term, is autonomous, right? It doesn't require something outside of it to control what it's doing. And then you might say, well, okay, well, sure, but this kind of behavior is not really the same as a human or an animal that engages in what we might call intentional behavior, right? There's no intentionality behind a swinging pendulum. It's just dumb swinging back and forth. But we also want to point out, though, that yes, that's true, but a pendulum still exhibits what we might call a pattern of behavior, or importantly, we might call it ordered behavior, right? And what do I mean by ordered behavior? It just means that there's an order or structure or pattern to what it's doing. And of course, it swings back and forth, and that's a pattern, but it's a little bit more detailed than that because there's also a dynamical law of pendulum behavior. The duration of the swing, what we call the period of oscillation or repetition, or its cycle, hence the term cyclical above, is constrained by two important parameters. One is a parameter that's inherent to the pendulum itself, which is the length of the pendulum. The other is gravity, which is going to be a fixed constant on Earth, but obviously it could change in a different environment. And so this means that the swinging rate and entire pattern and order of the pendulum's behavior really represents an interaction between some property of the pendulum and a property of its environment, namely the gravitational field that it is in. And therefore the interaction between those two things, something internal and something external, or intrinsic to the pendulum and extrinsic to the pendulum, are what creates the behavior of the pendulum. Now, neither of those two things in and of themselves are controlling the pendulum, right? But rather the pendulum's behavior, and there's the important word, emerges from the interaction between these intrinsic and extrinsic factors, right? Let me say that again. The behavior of the pendulum, the structure, the order of the pendulum's behavior emerges from the interaction of the intrinsic and the extrinsic factors at work here, namely the length of the pendulum and the gravitational field. That means that without any external controller, the behavior of the pendulum is regular, it is predictable, it is lawful, it can be described by an equation. And that's what I mean by it is self-organized. It exhibits an emergent pattern. That pattern emerges from the interaction of the intrinsic and the extrinsic factors. And that makes it self-controlled. It is a totally autonomous system, right? It's not controlled by anything external, right? It isn't controlled by gravity. Gravity certainly plays a role, but gravity doesn't play the only role in the action of the pendulum. Properties of the pendulum also play an equally important role. In fact, you can't really describe the behavior of the pendulum without describing both the intrinsic and the extrinsic forces. And that's exactly what I was trying to get at when defining the affordance earlier, which is that you can't define the affordance without describing intrinsic properties of the person who might be grasping, for example, versus the extrinsic properties of things out there that may or may not be graspable, right? So we would say here that at the act of grasping could be treated like a pendulum in a metaphorical way or an analogous way as being an autonomous action that is an emergent uh, form from the interaction between a grasping agent and a graspable object. Therefore, the action becomes self-organized. It doesn't need a controller. It controls and organizes itself. It exhibits a stability on its own. And so the idea is that since we can develop equations like a dynamic equation for describing the rate of oscillation of a pendulum, can we potentially apply similar kinds of dynamical equations to describe human action? And the answer to that is yes, we can. And in particular, I use the pendulum example very importantly because there are actual body parts that can behave like a pendulum. For example, when you're walking and your arms are swinging, they exhibit something that's very much akin to pendular dynamics. Likewise, your legs, especially like your lower leg hanging from the knee, also exhibits pendular dynamics. And in fact, we might think of the leg and the arm as what we call segmented pendulums, right? A pendulum nested one another pendulum. And there are therefore a lot of pendulum-related dynamical equations that can be used to describe different gaits of a person walking. Further, another kind of a dynamical system is a mass spring system. So imagine you have a spring mounted on the ceiling, so it's hanging down, and you're going to put a weight or mass at the bottom of the spring, and it's going to have a particular resting length, right? And if I were to pull on that and then let it go, that spring is going to bounce up and down, right? And then eventually what's going to happen is that the spring will return to the original resting state. And no matter what I do to this pendulum to perturb it and move it around and make it bounce around, it will always return to the same resting length. And that again is a sort of order or pattern or regularity of behavior that this pendulum will exhibit. And the rate at which it does so is a function of things like the stiffness of the and damping of the pendulum, but it still returns to that resting state. Again, the resting state is a property of some intrinsic properties of the pendulum. Again, its stiffness and the actual amount of mass attached to it, as well as the gravitational field that it's in, right? So the behavior, what we call this state, this tendency to always return to that particular state is, again, an emergent pattern of intrinsic and extrinsic properties. And it is self-organized, right? There's nothing external to the spring that controls this. I mentioned this example because the muscles of the body have spring-like properties to them. And maybe we can apply these mass spring dynamical equations to describe the action of muscles in a certain way. So now let's get to the issue here of talking about cyclical and continuous action. So walking, as I said, sort of like with the pendulum swinging, the repetition of the legs moving and swinging and the arms as well is a cyclical action. If a person is waving, that is also a cyclical action. Chewing is cyclical. Shaking hand, brushing your teeth. And some actions are cyclical in ways that we may not be entirely obvious, like when you're talking. Obviously, it's not completely repetitive in the sense that you're not just making the same sounds over and over again. It's not like you're just saying ba 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 ba, but you are necessarily still engaging in actions of the speech articulators, your lips, tongue, and jaw, that are in very many ways repetitive and cyclical. And the act of writing with a pencil may be very well as well. And what about reaching for something, right? Well, again, the idea is that when I reach out for something like I'm picking up the apple off the table, I reach out, then I bring it to my mouth, and then I put it back to the table. So again, there's repetition there. And so there's, again, maybe we can describe this in terms of these kinds of equations that describe the cyclical action of a swinging pendulum or a a mass spring that bounces up and down, but eventually returns to a resting state. So what we would say here is that if we can succeed with this, if we can capture the movements of a person engaging in these kinds of actions using the dynamical equations derived from mass spring dynamics or pendular dynamics, then we could describe actions in ways that are much more autonomous and self-organized, right? But the idea is that this would be a perception action system, right? So because we have to incorporate the intrinsic and the extrinsic factors, right? And so the extrinsic factors come through perception, and the intrinsic factors are part of the physical constraints or a particular embodiment of our actor here. So as I've already said, we're going to get spatiotemporal perceptual information that can feed directly into spatiotemporal actions. And that way we can make sure that perception and action are comparable in terms of the kind of information that they rely on. The nature of the perceptual information will determine the kind of action that can be performed, and therefore it will influence the apparent movement dynamic, right? What kind of dynamical response is required for this particular perceptual situation. So in this case, we could say that the perception action cycle exhibits particular stability. It exhibits a particular structure and pattern that is self-organized. We don't need an external controller here. So it's an autonomous system, not an autonomous system again, right? And I've already mentioned here that muscles have spring-like properties. And one way to think about how we might kind of take advantage of the spring-like properties of muscles here is imagine if I'm going to reach, let's say, for example, that I can imagine that what the goal of the nerve commands from the brain to the muscles are is to set the resting length of a pendulum, just like we said before that a mass spring system has a particular resting state, and that the mass spring, when perturbed, will always return to its resting state. So what if we hypothesize a situation where the job of the descending nerve commands to the muscles is to determine the resting length of that muscle as a mass spring system. And what would happen is that the muscle has a specific length right now, but if a descending signal alters the resting length of that muscle, then what's going to happen is that the muscle will engage in its own self-organized response to that by moving to the appropriate new resting length, just the same way that if I were to perturb a mass spring, it will return to its desired resting length. I'm using the word desire there quite a bit loosely, right? So in this situation, the muscle doesn't have to be told how much to contract and how much muscle force is required to contract. It simply it self-organizes its own contraction to achieve the appropriate resting length that has been altered by the descending nerve command, right? So what we're saying here is that that all we need to do is specify to the muscles here what kind of spatiotemporal response is needed based on the perceptual input, and the muscles will just handle the details, right? And will achieve the particular movement endpoint. And so that's all we need to do is specify what the desired movement endpoint is, and the muscles will achieve that, right? So this is part, I know I haven't really gotten into a lot of really specific detail here, but I just want to present the essence of the idea that according to a dynamical systems approach, we really don't have true control, like in control theory, but rather we just have, that's why I put control in quotes on this slide. Rather, we just have a muscular perception action system that is self-organized and autonomous based on spatiotemporal information. Okay, well, that wraps that up. And now that's the end of that particular content.